the Windows environment, the graphic user interface. A couple of young entrepreneurs, Bill Gates of Microsoft and Steve Jobs at Apple, went to have a look at what Xerox were doing with their personal computers. And they took great note and went on to reshape the world. Xerox still makes photocopiers. In 1975, Stephen Sasson, an engineer, invented the first digital camera. And he went on to invent the first digital SLR camera in the 1980s. And this was the invention which would destroy a great corporation, Eastman Kodak. Curious thing is, Stephen Sasson worked for Eastman Kodak. In 1999, Sony created the precursor to the iPod. Of course, they didn't call it the precursor to the iPod. They called it the digital memory stick Walkman. Now, think about Sony. Sony had the best digital engineers in the world. They had the best brand in the world with the Walkman. Walkman used to be really cool, I promise. I mean, I know we're supposed to be talking about the 70s, not the 80s, but still. And they had Sony Music, they had Celine Dion, they had Bob Dylan. They had everything they needed to take over the world of digital music players. But we know what came later. What came later was the iPod. Sony went absolutely nowhere. And of course, in 1918, the British Army had a massive technological superiority in the form of the tank, and they had the best theorist in the world, the best military theorist in the world, in the form of JFC Fuller. And they utterly squandered the advantage and let it pass to the Germans. So the puzzle that I've been trying to resolve is, why does this happen? Why do apparently capable organizations come up with brilliant ideas and then lose them, squander them? So here's the theory. The theory is that people are idiots. So at the end of the First World War, one of Fuller's fellow officers in the British Army said, "Well, thank goodness that's over. We can get back to some real soldiering." Well, as though defending your country in an existential struggle against a mortal enemy isn't real soldiering. It's just a distraction from polishing buttons and nice horses. That's extraordinary. And you could see some evidence of idiocy elsewhere. So when Steve Jobs went to Xerox PARC in 1979, he was astonished. He said, "This is the greatest thing. Why aren't you doing anything with this? This is amazing." And you feel that if he'd been teleported into the British War Office in the 1920s, he'd have said pretty much the same thing. Field Marshal Sir Archibald Montgomery Massingberd, who was in charge of the British Army in the 1930s, he did notice Adolf Hitler's military build-up, and he announced, as a countermeasure, that hay for the horses would be increased tenfold, that every cavalry officer would get a spare horse, and that every tank officer would also get a horse. Of course, at the time, JFC Fuller was producing book after book, prize-winning essay after prize-winning essay, explaining how to use these new technologies. Montgomery Massingberd said, "No, I haven't read his book. It would only annoy me." So, people are idiots, maybe. The only thing about that, I mean, it's a satisfying explanation. It's good to get a round of applause, but it feels too glib. So when you look at, for example, Sony in the 1990s, were they really run by idiots? Or Kodak? I mean, Kodak made a huge amount of money from digital photography through the patents of these amazing devices that they were building. But they weren't idiots. They just somehow couldn't get to grips with the technology they'd created. So another theory as to what's happening has been made famous by Clayton Christensen, late Clayton Christensen, who wrote this famous book, The Innovator's Dilemma. And Clayton Christensen said, no, it's not that people are idiots. Here's what happens. Technology comes from below. You get a new technology, and it's inferior to the old technology. So the digital camera, it's the size of a shoebox, it's the price of a car, it's very low resolution. Most people would not want a digital camera. But it has a few specialist uses. And so those specialist uses develop the technology, and it slowly develops. And meanwhile, the salespeople in the original organization who are making film cameras, they don't notice it. The customers of the original organization don't notice it. And then one day, the new technology just bursts on the scene. It's mature and it's better than the old technology. This is disruptive innovation. And that's an elegant theory, and it fits some of what's going on, but I don't know. I mean, was the iPod a disruptive innovation? I mean, if you ask BlackBerry, yes, it was. The iPhone, wiped out by the iPhone. But was the iPhone an inferior competitor to the phones that went before that slowly got better and better and better? That doesn't seem to fit the facts. Or the idea that the PC, the personal computer at Xerox PARC, was like a low-quality competitor to the photocopier. That doesn't make any sense either. So I don't think that Clayton Christensen's explanation really fits everything that we need to understand. So here's another idea. It comes from a young economist called Rebecca Henderson in 1990. She said that the reason that old organizations struggle to deal with new things is really to do with this rather boring word, organizations. It's to do with the structure of the organization itself. And that might seem a bit odd, so let me give you an example and maybe make it clearer. So we're supposed to be talking about the 1970s. One of the most famous things that happened in the 1970s, of course, was the moment that IBM lost its dominance over the global computer industry. So what was going on with IBM? At first, it seems like the same sort of story as Kodak. New technology comes along, and this old company can't adjust to the new technology. But IBM had been adjusting to new technologies for half a century. It was an incredible survivor. You think about all of the different technological innovations that had come along in computing from the 1920s, the 1930s, through to the 1970s. IBM throughout is flourishing. So why is that? Well, because even though the technology has changed, the organizational skills that you need, the budget codes and the human resources standards and the branding, it's pretty much the same whether you're selling a room-sized mainframe computer to a bank in the 1970s or you're selling a room-sized tabulating machine to a bank in the 1930s. You need armies of engineers, you're signing multi-million-dollar contracts, and it's the same basic problem. And then suddenly, the computer becomes a thing that small businesses are buying, and that people are just going to shops and buying in the store, and that parents are buying for their kids. And where is your army of engineers and your army of salespeople now? It doesn't fit anymore. And that was the moment when IBM really started to struggle. And funnily enough, they actually created a very successful personal computer division, but the parent company tried so hard to protect it, look after it, kill it, that in the end it had to be sold off because it just didn't fit, didn't make any sense for it to be in the old organization. So what Rebecca Henderson is describing here is this process where you've got an organization that's incredibly good, a bureaucracy that's incredibly good at delivering a particular result. And then the world changes and the organization can't. And we heard Balaji talking earlier about building nation states around the printing press, an amazing technology, and then the struggle of adjusting when the printing press is no longer cutting edge. And you can see this